preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to be here for this very special lecture. The second Goldberg Lecturer is Hanna Gray, President of the University of Chicago. Born in Heidelberg, Germany, Dr. Gray received a BA degree from Bryn Mawr College in 1950 and a PhD in history from Harvard University in 1957. From 1950 to 52, she was a Fulbright Scholar at Oxford University. Dr. Gray has served as professor of history of some of this country's finest institutions, including Bryn Mawr, Harvard, the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and Yale. She became provost at Yale in 1974, and from 1977 to 78, she was also acting president. In 1978, she became the 10th president of the University of Chicago. Dr. Gray is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the Renaissance Society of America and the American Philosophical Society. She has been a fellow of the Newberry Library, a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, and she is currently an honorary fellow at St. Anne's College, Oxford. She is a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board and the Council of Foreign Relations, and is a trustee of the University of Chicago, Bryn Mawr College, the National Humanities Center, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Brookings Institution, among others. She's received many honorary degrees, including ones from Yale, Brown, Princeton, Brandeis, and Rochester. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Philosophical Society, a member of the National Academy of Education, and recipient this year of the Medal of Liberty. In a recent survey published in the Chronicle of Higher Education of 485 presidents, scholars, directors of higher education associations, and other officials, Dr. Gray was listed among the top 5 college presidents in the country. The effective college president was described by James L. Fisher, President Emeritus of the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education, as, and I quote, a strong risk taker with a dream. Hanna Gray has taken many risks and has realized many dreams. We are honored that she is here with us tonight to talk about education and vocation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hanna Gray.
Thank you. I thank you very much indeed, and I want to thank Dr. Kinney for her kind introduction and to congratulate Dr. Kinney, or certainly her institution, on a marvelous appointment and on a distinguished presidency. And I want to thank Dr. Kinney also for being willing to refer to me as a historian more or less in the present tense. One of the great pains of my present profession is to be asked with that very careful and hesitant courtesy that is usually reserved for those known to have been recently bereaved or incarcerated, what did you used to be? And the implication is that one has passed to the other shore, one has become academically déclassé, and one has forfeited all title to academic pretension. Now, this, of course, ignores the possibility that the distance separating a historian studying the politics of the Renaissance Italian city-state from an administrator dealing with the politics of academic departments may actually be quite negligible. And in my own case, perhaps it also ignores, and perhaps I ought to be thankful for that, the fact that I have written scholarly articles on Machiavelli But nonetheless, the view that university presidents must be failed or recusant academics is a powerful one for all who see the calling of teaching and of learning, quite rightly, as the defining vocation of a university. And perhaps, though I can't really tell you whether I'm right, it was that was in the minds of the students who in 1780 addressed the president of Harvard in the following words. They said to him, "As a man of genius and knowledge, we respect you. As a man of piety and virtue, we venerate you. As a president, we despise you." In a more serious vein, I would argue that the background of a historian is in fact entirely relevant, not only to my own so-called profession and vocation, but indeed to any other that I can think of, because there is surely a relationship between thinking historically and trying to analyze complicated questions, between awareness of the historical nature of complex institutions and the contexts of change and of continuity in their existence. Surely a relationship between trying to understand different points of view and different objectives of individuals and groups and working with those to something where one tries to approach rational and informed decisions. Historical mindedness, it seems to me, is not a specialized kind of expertise. It is a part of being an educated person and part, it seems to me, of being a thoughtful professional in any area. And that, in the end, I think, is what liberal learning, genuine learning, is about. I think that liberal learning looks always to context, to the relatedness of things, to the connectedness of issues and of questions that we encounter in a very complicated universe and in a very complicated set of circumstances. I think liberal learning looks always to critical judgment. And in doing so, it must take and teach us to take the long view. And it must refuse and teach us to refuse to evade the innate ambiguity and complexity of any question that is worth asking and any question that is worth trying to answer. And that is really what I'd like to talk about this evening, and that is, what is the vocation of attempting to achieve those ends? And in doing so, perhaps I may begin with 3 texts that will help us to frame that particular theme. One is very simple and comes from an author not known for brevity of statement, namely Cicero, who once said, "Not to know what happened before you were born is to remain always a child." The second comes from Alfred North Whitehead, who talked about the university in the following way. He said, "A university imparts information, but it imparts it imaginatively. At least this is the function that it should perform for society. A university which fails in this respect has no reason for existence. Imagination is not to be divorced from the facts. It is a way of illuminating the facts. The tragedy of the world is that those who are imaginative have but slight experience, and those who are experienced have feeble imaginations. Fools act on imagination without knowledge. Pedants act on knowledge without imagination. The task of a university is to weld together imagination and experience." And that emphasis on imagination, on the illumination of learning in contrast to the mere possession of facts, is, I take it, what we mean by education in its serious sense. That desire to see how imaginative knowledge may shed light on experience gives meaning to our belief that education is not only a good in itself, but is ultimately part of the larger reality of life, rather than a way station on the road to something called experience, or simply the real world, whatever that is meant to be. And finally, my third text comes from T.S. Eliot, who wrote, "It is a part of the function of education to help us to escape not from our own time, for we are bound by that, but from the intellectual and emotional limitations of our own time." And that, I think, suggests something of the sense in which education helps us to make a connection with what has come before as well as what exists outside ourselves and our experience, to look beyond the narrow confines of the self and its constraints, and to imagine and empathize with as well as to appreciate the experience and culture of a larger world and of other people. Now, all these views may seem familiar, and so too may an oration in defense of the liberal arts, which was a fine Renaissance theme in and of itself. And yet nowadays, sometimes they appear less taken for granted in a world that sometimes appears guided by the inspired dictum of Ogden Nash, who said progress might have been all right once, but it's gone on too long. And in the current commentary that we have on education, there is too both a sense that perhaps progress has gone on too long, and perhaps a quality of commentary that was best summarized for me in many ways by Andrew Hacker, writing in the New York Review of Books some years ago. He said, "The current debate over education, like so many before it, illuminates the symbolic use of our schools. We project onto them nostalgia for a past that only partially existed, plus blueprints for a future we may not entirely want. And our fantasies about them are underpinned by the belief that here is a subject in which anyone can be an expert." At this point, he went on, all we can say with certainty is that no one really knows how far education contributes to the kind of people we ultimately become. But if the schools leave a lot to be desired, the quality of educational commentary has declined even further. And to that I say amen. We no longer, he said, have commanding figures like John Dewey and Robert Hutchins. I can't help remarking that both were identified with the University of Chicago. John Dewey and Robert Hutchins, who in their different ways tried to create a vision of an educated citizenry whose members would have some chance at something that could be called the good life. Nowadays, everybody remains an expert in the Hacker sense on education. And a great many of the commentators on education have been going out into the field and examining the state of American higher education. These contemporary observers and commentaries don pith helmets, and sometimes they get as far west as the Hudson, and they conduct field work in the contemporary groves of academe. And their reports back to the home base, sometimes it seems to me, might well evoke the immortal utterance of President or General Eisenhower, who once said, "Things have never been more like the way they are today in history." Now, all of them come, I'd say, to that conclusion. We've had a whole spate of reports in recent years that have essentially told us that, and there's some very recent ones, as well as some recent public statements as well. But beyond this common conclusion, the new field studies find and report two very different myths of a golden age out there. And both of those myths are abroad in the world of higher education. They're both located in the past, and both remind us, in the words of the sage, that the golden age was never the present. And quite apart from the picture they present of a sadly deficient current time, measured against the vision of a much better past, both tend to forget the important truth that the future ain't what it used to be, or indeed that the schools ain't what they used to be and never was, according to Will Rogers. Now, the reports that we've seen that have come to these conclusions and that have presented us with these new myths of a better time are reports which have been issued particularly on the college curriculum and its degradation, on the academic profession and its shortcomings. We have seen at the same time an intensified questioning in the larger public of the value of higher education, an intensified questioning of the value to be assigned or the priority to be accorded, rather, by national policy to the support of the central pursuits of higher education and to the principle also of realizing equal opportunities of access and choice for its students in our society. And we have seen finally, by no means for the first time in our history, an accentuated conflict and concern over the purposes and values that higher education, both graduate and undergraduate, and the institutions of higher education might exist to serve. Now, the diagnosis, then, of the state of undergraduate, and by extension, therefore, also of graduate education, which these reports have rendered, are extremely gloomy. And the headlines which they provoke are often rather sensational. Crisis in our colleges, the crisis of the liberal arts, the urgent need for the renewal and reform of everything. The reports express anxiety about the decline of the liberal arts in the face of vocationalism, of pedantry, of over-specialization. They express concern about the nature of graduate training and the character of the PhD, which they see as reinforcing these unhappy trends. They express alarm about the overemphasis on research at the expense of teaching in the academic world. Like many other discussions, these reports tend to treat higher education as a whole and its faculty as a single entity, despite rhetorical deference to the principles of pluralism and diversity. It's rather as though there were just one kind of institution of higher education in our country. And finally, they contrast a past of shared values, of dedication to clear educational missions in the service of civic goals, cultural standards, and individual growth, a past of curricular coherence allied to all these goods, against a present incoherence and abandonment of standards on all these fronts. In these views, the golden age floats somewhere uneasily in a timeless stratosphere that is asserted nonetheless to have existed in a nameless historical space. But of course, such pictures tell us ultimately more, such utopian pictures really, tell us ultimately more about the views of their authors than about the complexities of history or about what things were really like at an earlier time. They offer simplifications of a past that never quite existed in reality. They offer clocks that can't be turned back. In order to mount a critique of the present and its directions and to construct a model of an ideal social order. And such passionate critiques say a great deal that is to the point. They stimulate, however much they may distort the past or caricature the present, they stimulate the debate and review in which we need recurringly to engage. To my mind, the attitudes that they present toward both graduate training and research can much too easily turn into a kind of condemnation and slapstick and trivialization of research and scholarship. It's rather as though such critics of higher education and of the collegiate experience agreed with the person who said that what a PhD dissertation really is moving a pile of bones from one graveyard to another. Or they like to perhaps recall the great book review written once by Moses Haddis over a book of a classical colleague of his. It was a one-sentence review. It said, "This book fills a much-needed gap." It's very easy, like Senator Proxmire awarding the Golden Fleece Award, to caricature and to trivialize scholarship by the titles of its monographs. And it's very easy to read learned journals and feel that such caricature is all too close to the truth. But nonetheless, there is something that is exceptionally important in the neglect, I think, of the research and scholarly enterprise in these reviews of undergraduate education. They seem to forget that both teaching and research are ultimately dependent on the spirit in which they are conducted, that it is not a given curriculum or a given topic that will determine the quality of education or the quality of learning or the quality of discovery and interpretation, but that it is above all the spirit in which those are conducted and the ends toward which they are directed. And they forget also that there is an intimate and important bond between teaching and research, and that while that conflict can often be acute, it is ultimately a tension which, properly directed, creates its own coherence and is a constructive and productive tension. It seems to me bizarre to talk about undergraduate education and its aims without talking about graduate education and its purposes, because those who come through graduate training are those who are the shapers of the undergraduate curriculum and those who are the teachers of undergraduates, and the two need always to be considered in relationship to one another. So I think we are in serious need of far more thoughtful evaluations of the role of graduate education and research in the intellectual universe and central mission of universities, but of colleges as well, and in need of much more thoughtful analysis of the complex relation between teaching and research, graduate and undergraduate learning, and of the present state of graduate education, as well as the opportunity that exists for its renewal as well in the coming period of time. Now, the current discussions can perhaps be to some degree summarized in the newest of the reports that has appeared, and which Dr. Kenny is, I believe, going to Cambridge to discuss tomorrow. And that is the report of the Carnegie Foundation on the Advancement of Teaching, which I have read only in summary and hope not to have to read in its full form, though that I realize is an unscholarly attitude to take. There are several things which, in the summary of that report, are emphasized. One, that this report believes that there is a conflict between research and teaching. This discovery is awesome. And the Carnegie Foundation report, having discovered that such a conflict exists, it recommends also that there be more attention and more reward given for good teaching, and that distinguished teaching have its professorships as good research have its professorships. Secondly, the Carnegie report, finding that conflict between research and teaching, also at the same time tends rather to ignore that other dimension, namely graduate education or professional training. To read the summary is to read about a universe in which colleges are insulated. They are either standalone colleges without a relation to some larger system of higher education, or they are colleges and universities where the relationship between graduate and professional training and those colleges might never exist at all. And that seems in a curious way, but quite unintentionally, to replicate the kind of critique which has come in a much stronger form and a much more simplistic form from the Secretary of Education, who in his discussions of undergraduate education today seems not to believe that there are other kinds of education. Schools, perhaps, yes, but graduate and professional education are not within his purview at all. Secondly, the Carnegie report, like many others, expresses a tremendous nostalgia for what is called coherence. Everybody wants coherence. The Carnegie report says that knowledge has become so fragmented, and the forms of knowing and of the disciplines have become so fragmented, and the curricula of undergraduate education have followed those developments so closely that what is lacking in undergraduate education above all, and therefore in genuine education and liberal learning, is a sense of coherence. Now, coherence is, I think, a very complicated issue, and I would not criticize for a moment the desire for coherence, but I do not believe that coherence can be created by the titles that you list on a curriculum, or that coherence can be created in a universe of knowledge where it has not genuinely been discovered or uncovered or created. I think that the belief that coherence existed in the past is tied to a kind of nostalgia, is tied to the belief that it was better when knowledge was simpler and we could all share in it in some way that we could agree on. And perhaps that was better, but I doubt it. I think it is a reaction against an enormously complicated and still rapidly expanding universe of knowledge where we have not found the keys to unlock or the principles of selection by which to choose what it is that an entire society might agree are the conditions of a genuine education. I think finally that desire reflects something of the belief that educators and the education that they offer ought to be able to find it if anyone in our world can. Having said that, I think it is at the same time true that an undergraduate curriculum in and of itself does not create an education. It must be the expression of a set of convictions. It must be the expression of a set of principles and of the imaginations and the serious commitments of the faculty who teach them. But it is also the case that, however arbitrary from time to time the selection of what goes into it might be, the basic consensus that is needed to bring it about is something which people have all too rarely been willing to face. But I do see that there is more of that happening than there used to be. And finally, in the desire not to over-specialize, not to fragment, I think people also sometimes forget that a broad title in a curriculum can actually disguise a very specialized or pedantic treatment, and vice versa, that an apparently narrow topic can open up an entire universe. You think, for example, in a very simple example, of the different ways in which you might choose to teach the French Revolution. Someone might decide to go year by year. Well, year by year would be too broad. Go hour by hour or day by day through the events of the Revolution, and one would learn the chronology. Somebody else could take 2 years of the French Revolution and introduce students to the problem of revolution itself, to the question as to what it is not only that happened there at that time, not only what kinds of circumstances came together to make that happen, but to introduce the entire question, what is revolution? Does it follow these kinds of courses? Is this a classical instance of what we understand by basic social transformation, by basic political conflict, and so on and so forth? So I think one has to be also clear that at a time when knowledge appears to have become far more specialized and perhaps more fragmented, new ways of posing questions, which open up much broader ones, may well be taking place through what may look like very specialized subjects. I see it happening in the discipline of history, where the newer forms of social history have brought people into a kind of association with the study of anthropology and the application of modes of knowing and of research that come out of anthropology, out of sociology, even out of literary theory. And the newer history, while the topics sometimes look very small and are sometimes certainly eligible for a Moses Haddis review, on the other hand, may open up whole new ways of understanding our universe as well as of understanding our past. Finally, these reports emphasize, as so much public discussion does, so rightly, the conflict in our world between vocationalism and liberal learning, or in the much better phrase, really, of the Carnegie Report, between careerism and liberal learning. And it is there, above all, that the crisis is seen to exist, as a crisis of liberal learning, as the crisis of the liberal arts. Now, that typical terminology of a conflict between liberal and vocational education expresses, at one level, a strange confusion. The word vocational is used to describe training and a spirit of training that are directed narrowly to very technical and very specialized skills and to the satisfaction of external or career goals. Not so much training the mind as teaching a person to perform a particular activity without looking to right or to left. And yet, when we think of the deepest meaning of the word vocation, it is, of course, quite different. We think that by vocation, we mean a calling that embodies an inner and compelling commitment or imperative, a commitment to something larger than ourselves, to be followed because it is worthwhile in itself, and because it serves values of a larger and abiding character, bringing some benefit to some larger community. And it's in those terms that we speak of a religious vocation, or the vocation of a teacher, or indeed the vocation of liberal learning. And such a vocation may very well be professional in nature, when the choice of profession has to do with some larger imperative and purpose, and when those purposes help animate its practice. Now, it's interesting that we should use the term vocational to connote something that is so confined and so confining, rather than to express what might ideally be the continuing outcome of liberal learning, people with the sense of vocation, with a sense of the larger connections between their work and the goals of that work and some larger universe or community. And the consequences of educating for breadth of knowledge and for enlarged understanding, the effects of such training for professional and civic and private pursuits ought to be to arouse a sense of vocation rather than to reduce young men and women to unthinking vocationalism. And in our use of terminology, there is, I think, something symptomatic about the kinds of conflict and the kinds of issue that have characterized our discussion of what education is about and what education is for. Our society has had particularly always an ambivalence about liberal learning. The contrast between liberal and instrumental conceptions of knowledge and its potential benefits goes very far back in our history. Long ago, in his Democracy in America, de Tocqueville remarked on what he saw as the characteristic tendency of American culture to concentrate single-mindedly on applied rather than basic learning. He was concerned about too pronounced a bias toward practical application at the expense of basic knowledge, and he observed, "If the light by which we are guided is ever extinguished, it will dwindle by degrees and expire of itself. By dint of close adherence to mere applications, principles would be lost sight of, and when the principles were wholly forgotten, the methods could no longer be invented, and men would continue, without intelligence and without art, to apply scientific processes no longer understood." Those words continue to reverberate in today's debates over the nature and purpose of liberal education, in the tension of views that has persisted over what education is about and what education is for. And in the meantime, the issues of the present and of the future have taken on much more complex outlines since the age of de Tocqueville, and their illumination by the light of the principles of knowledge, as he put it, becomes ever more important to their proper application. Writing some 60 years ago, Alfred North Whitehead spoke to these questions. He said, "There are 2 points which differentiate our present age from the past. In the first place, The rate of progress is such that an individual human being of ordinary length of life will be called upon to face novel situations which find no parallel in his past. The fixed person for the fixed duties, who in older societies was such a godsend, in the future will be a public danger. In the second place, the modern professionalism and knowledge produces minds in a groove, but there is no groove of abstractions which is adequate for the comprehension of human life. In short, the specialized functions of the community are performed better and more progressively, but the generalized direction lacks vision. We are left with no expansion of wisdom and with greater need of it. Now, I indicated earlier that it seemed to me that the crisis of liberal learning or of the liberal arts was being somewhat exaggerated. By that, I don't mean for a moment to deny the serious problems that exist. But I think it's also well to remember that the belief that the liberal arts are in a state of crisis has been continuous over centuries, and not just decades. That should not surprise us. Of course, the liberal arts as a set of studies and disciplines have been variously defined over the centuries. And inevitably, a liberal education and its hopes have taken different shapes. And so, too, the controversies attached to debating the proper relation of the liberal arts to other modes of intellectual activity and to the quest for social utility are both very old and urgently new. And I think that in reflecting on the role of the liberal arts in higher education, we have to begin by acknowledging that these questions can never be fully laid to rest. They have to recur in each generation. The liberal arts, by definition, I would argue, have always to be in crisis. To begin with, there is no single tradition of liberal learning that is in some sense out there to be unreflectingly possessed, or that can somehow be genetically bred into us. Instead, there exists a developing tradition of liberal learning that needs continually to be defined and redefined, continually to be made our own and made to live anew, continually to be renewed. It requires a balance between continuity and new forms of approach that speaks to the way we think about those forms of knowledge most worth pursuing and possessing, those forms of knowledge we wish we had been able to acquire at an earlier time, those we think will be most appropriate, most urgent for our children and for the future, because to think about these things is, above all, our way of thinking about the future. It is a way, and one of the most important we have, of sketching out our ideal of life and of human purpose, our ideal of a human society, our hopes for what may be possible for those yet to come that we would help and hope to help them to achieve. And therefore, it's not surprising at all that the great works of educational philosophy have not been written by committees, like recent reports, but they've been written by utopians and quasi-utopians, by Plato, by Rousseau, by Thomas More, who may or may not have been a utopian, but was at least a quasi-utopian, by other great minds, some of whom wrote exemplary autobiographies, a St. Augustine, a Descartes, all of whom asked themselves, how might we create an ideal society, an ideal human being? What is our conception of human purpose? What kind of knowledge is most important to realize that purpose? What are the potentialities of the human capacity to know and to act on knowledge? What is it that is knowable? And how do we come through that knowledge to self-understanding, or to the understanding of society, or to the understanding of the universe, or to the shaping of the future? They were, in effect, inquiring, what role can education have in creating such a society and shaping such people? I think at some point the values that we assert as those by which we guide life in the present must be values that we attempt to achieve and to further for succeeding generations through education. And on the other side, allied to the utopian impulse, there is another impulse, and that is to use such models of ideal education as a way of criticizing the present, as a way of exposing what is deficient not only in contemporary education, but in contemporary ethics and government, and the manners and conduct of a world which we may deplore as corrupt and which its reformers would wish to see measure up to a higher standard. That critical awareness of the deficiencies of the present and the attempt to discern the contours of the future leads inevitably again to thinking about education, to thinking about what education is about, to thinking about what education is for. So that to think about liberal education is to reflect on the human condition, its powers and limitations, its worst uncertainties and follies, its best intentions and aspirations, its social possibilities, and its capacity for engagement in a state of civilized culture. At the center of such liberal learning lie the humanities, or more precisely, the humanistic spirit, for the latter are not, alas, or the latter is not, the humanistic spirit, alas, automatically present in the former, namely the humanities as practiced, or taught, or studied. By their nature, the humanities have to do with the worlds of history and human expression, with a struggle toward understanding and judgment in the midst of complexity and contingency, with problems of value and of choice, of knowledge and of diverse methods of knowing, in matters that are ambiguous, often paradoxical, rarely susceptible to clear-cut solutions, always in need of reinterpretation and reevaluation. The study of the humanities is above all an engagement with subjects and the questions they raise that are worthy and interesting in themselves, illuminated in turn by the questions brought to them by each person. We hope that this enables in each individual the growth of a capacity which will continue to grow and to be exercised, a capacity compounded of intellectual integrity, independent critical judgment, sensitive thoughtfulness, sympathetic imagination, and historical sense, and enlarged moral and aesthetic awareness, what I would call an ambitious intellectual modesty, which respects the limitations as well as the richness of humane learning. And we hope, I think, that such capacity, while necessarily individual, is not simply of private cultivation, but that its effective exercise makes possible a shared discourse and understanding, a deepened citizenship within some series of larger communities, and even a communication with minds past and still to come. The debate over liberal education, its character and purposes, has always been centrally an argument over the value of humanistic learning and its consequences. The canon of liberal studies now, of course, includes a great deal more than the humanities, and to the benefit of the liberal arts. But the ideas associated with liberal education have carried with them the assumption that the humanistic spirit must infuse the approach to and permeate the goals of all instruction that might be called truly liberal. That humanistic and social scientific perspectives conjoin in the study of civilization is taken for granted now. That all students should be acquainted with the methods and principles of the natural sciences is an article of faith, but still far less realized in practice. In fact, still rarely in practice. That the liberal curriculum, however composed, should aim to nurture an informed attention to the connectedness and relatedness of things, and to do so with intellectual curiosity and discrimination and with some power of bringing moral judgment and social discernment to their analysis. All that brings us back to the case for the humanistic ideal, and in such visions of liberal learning stands the specter of the instrumental spirit. It too has many faces and names. It too has a recurrent influence. Its symptoms and products nowadays are most frequently associated with that kind of vocationalism or careerism that we see too frequently, with a conception of narrow professionalism, of mere expertise, with excessive specialization, with false notions of what is called relevance, even with an anti-intellectual leaning to short-term utilitarian ends, and finally, again, with that incoherence and fragmentation of educational structure about which people are concerned. Now, we have seen these accusations that have to do with the state of the liberal arts, of course, leveled particularly against the humanities themselves within the broad area of liberal arts. And in the years that have intervened between the strong, if uneven, confidence of the early 1960s and the very anxious doubt of the 1980s, we have seen an ancient debate once more intensified against the background of more general developments that have affected higher education. Accompanying the growth, evolution, and diversification of American higher education in the century, certain persistent themes have emerged and reemerged in arguing the place of liberal learning. These have been concerned with the perceived threat posed by science or scientism, and with the eroding influence of professionalization and specialization in our academic world. But these themes could not now be framed as they were, for example, at the turn of the century, when there were deep debates about the effects of scientism on liberal culture, provoked above all by the institution of the elective system at Harvard under the direction of President Eliot. Nor could they be framed as they were at that time when the university was emerging as a research and graduate institution in addition to a collegiate institution. They could not be framed in the same way because the basic canon of disciplines has changed, and what was once hotly debated has now come to be taken for granted in the relationship of teaching and research. It is agreed, I think, that all basic subjects can be degraded by applying to them exclusively a technical treatment and outlook. I think it is agreed that properly approached as bodies of knowledge and modes of discovery, they can advance understanding and broaden the mind, and that it is here, rather than in establishing a sovereignty for one area of learning alone or one curriculum alone, that the real questions of liberal learning are met. And despite a prevalent rhetoric which speaks of higher education as though it were a single entity, we do in fact give adherence to a pluralism of means and ends, of types of institutions, and of their missions. And yet, despite this altered frame of reference, the language we here invoke to diagnose the crisis of the liberal arts is naturally and necessarily familiar. What is most often striking is the tenor of that language, the defensiveness of tone, the uncertainty of pitch. What is most often disturbing to my mind is the present-mindedness, so characteristic of current discourse, which imagines the future as an extension on life support systems, so to speak, of the present. We really do forget too easily that the future ain't what it used to be. In thinking about these matters, it seems to me that, and I suppose it can only be basically a moral exhortation, the most important requirement is that we avoid that narrow present-mindedness. We're also, I think, obligated to abandon the concentration on the narrower language of relevance, which has too often dominated public apologetic for the liberal arts and arguing against the forms and styles of the anti-humanistic spirit. Our first argument should not be that liberal learning will produce people who will advance the economic interests of our country. Perhaps they will, but that should not be our first argument. And it is too often the case that that notion of the relevance of a genuine education to the pursuit of such national purposes has dominated the rhetoric in this day and age. I think that it is essential for those who care about the liberal arts and for the institutions which give sustenance to liberal learning and reflection to begin with an acknowledgement of the inherent and complex character of that expanding universe of language and communication, of thought and artistic expression, of history and ethics, of philosophy and political reasoning, of human culture and the search for meaning which they comprehend. That has to be done without timidity and without arrogance, without inflating the claims to be made on behalf of the liberal arts, and with a due deference to the limits of understanding and its power, but also with a proper respect for the central importance of that restricted illumination in its processes which may help us avoid falling for cheap and simple interpretations of life and history. That's a quotation. It's a quotation from my father, who in writing about the history of modern Germany and in reflecting on the evils and the horrors of what happened to Germany in the 1930s, said of the German people that perhaps one of the most terrible consequences for German culture was that they had fallen for cheap and simple interpretations of life and history. In the later 1960s, 20 years ago, the rhetoric of relevance seemed sometimes to drown out that of liberal and humane learning. The assault on education and its institutions as illiberal, as unconnected to or concerned with the real world and its most pressing issues, all that became to some degree an attack on the classical forms of humanism. And humanists, sometimes finding themselves the enemies of those who they thought were their allies and protégés, often dismayed by sectarian scholasticism within their own ranks, increasingly doubtful that the outcome of their work and their teaching mattered so clearly, were half persuaded of the charges made against them that their work and their subjects were irrelevant. And they underwent, I think, sometimes a serious loss of confidence in their own vocation and sense of vocation. That had something to do with the loosening of the curriculum in those years. But there were other determinants, including the belief that older rigidities could not accommodate, could not do justice to the structure of an intellectual universe that offered far more to be learned and far more ways of knowing than any single system could possibly assert or organize as the basic forms of learning. For many, the best approach to the general was through the apparently particular, and many different particulars, it was thought, could reveal the larger end. But where the aim of liberation was imposed on the curriculum as a statement that immediate social relevance might be the measure of student choice, or that student choice should prevail because it was just that, then both academic responsibility and educational standards easily crumbled or could even be abdicated. And with that, too, there developed a curious false egalitarianism. False because it was applied to subjects and criteria of learning rather than to the opportunities and equities of the educational system. It was turned especially on the traditional liberal arts, which were thought to be elitist. What was considered all right in sports or business turned out not to be acceptable at all in learning. As Martin Marty has written, fear of sounding elitist has led humanists to shrink from arguing that there are standards, however hard to define, and excellences, however elusive their term. Now, another term that has become fashionable and is often applied to the humanities and to the arts is the term quality of life. The liberal arts are meant to do a great deal for this. And such rhetoric may all too easily reduce the liberal arts to amenities of human existence. It would be far better, I think, to recall them to a more fundamental purpose, which has to do with the quality of civilization and its difficult sustenance and preservation and elaboration, and to recall their institutions to the long-term view. Universities have above all the obligation to be doing that, to be cultivating what may be unfashionable while criticizing what is accepted, and extending the reach by which cultural traditions may be understood. They must make the case for liberal education for citizens in a free society and for the training of future scholars and teachers who will be urgently needed to carry on that tradition while giving new life to its practice. Now, the humanities exist then as all subjects worth pursuing exist, to be taught and studied, experienced and reflected upon. Even the solitude of the scholar or the writer is only a means to a larger communication and engagement with other minds and intentions. I do not mean for a moment to say that all education is education in the humanities or the liberal arts, or that these define in themselves the only knowledge worth having. But I do mean that if the spirit and caring for education and for learning is not pervaded by a humanistic purpose, then neither the civic nor the cultural goals that we seek, and that do have to do with abiding convictions about human liberty and integrity and the goods and goals of a humane society, will be furthered, and we will have failed to understand and control those forces and technologies that we should try to master and direct. And perhaps that sounds utopian, but I don't really think it is. So what, you may ask, does all this have then to do with the real world? I think we have to answer that the enduring world of the humanities and of liberal learning more generally is a dimension of that world, is the interpreter of that world. And how, it is asked, now as earlier, can an education of this kind prepare us for the real world? And again, we should answer not simply in terms of civic and professional relevance, but we should point out that the real world is not the present, but a world to some extent unknown, mystifying and changing, and that the power to deal with and make sense of that, to understand change, and to perceive connections, to master the old and to rethink the new, may be the most important preparation we can hope for. There's a line of Euripides that says, "Whoso neglects learning in his youth loses the past and is dead for the future." And that precept remains, I think, as good as any for expressing the role of liberal learning and the constant need for its renewal. It requires not the rejection of history, but a respect for and an attachment to history which at the same time refuses to accept the world simply as it is, or to escape into a future detached from its complexities. What then is the vocation that is associated with education? There is in that vocation an important goal of seeking to find coherence. Coherence understood, I think, as a coherence of mission. Coherence understood, I think, as a consistency of purpose. Coherence understood, I think, as the search for making coherent a variety of complex issues, of seeking to impose some order, and of understanding how that order is never complete. I think it's a coherence that has to do with representing an appropriate spectrum of knowledge and ways of knowing, with the aim of stimulating both a wider cultivation in individuals, a respect for the life of the mind, an adherence to the canons of intellectual liberty, a commitment to living by the principle of intellectual integrity, a stimulation of the habit of reflectiveness. What is the role of institutions? If I'm allowed to, since Dr. Kinney is a distinguished alumna of the University of Chicago, let me quote from Robert Maynard Hutchins, who said, in very short form, what I think is the vocation of an institution of higher education. He said, "The university is the institution that performs its highest, its unique service to society by declining to do what the society thinks it wants, by refusing to be useful in the common acceptance of that word, and by insisting instead that its task is understanding and criticism. It is a center of independent thought. And it's a wonderful statement of the social role of the university, because it also says that that university, that stance, is its contribution to society. That is, I think, how one might express the institutional vocation to which universities might be committed. And there's another statement which was made by Hannah Arendt once about an admired friend whom she was eulogizing at his death, that expresses the individual translation of that stance. She spoke of this friend in the following way. She said, "A stranger in the world, never quite at home in it, and at the same time a realist. It would have been easy for him to conform, for he knew the world very well. It would have been easier for him, a greater temptation in all probability, to escape into some utopianism. His whole spiritual existence was built on the decision never to conform and never to escape, which is only another way of saying that it was built on courage." If we talk about the vocation of being educated as one in which we try to live by intellectual integrity and understand that to live in that way is to take the critical stance while at the same time not evading complexity, then it seems to me she has described for us what that vocation is ultimately about. I thank you for your patience.
I always feel reassured when I hear Dr. Gray speak, because I have the feeling that the top leadership in American universities is in very good hands indeed. We are fortunate, I think, not only to have you with us tonight, but to have you as such a prominent voice in what is happening in education in this country. I want to ask you several questions in connection with a theme that continued to reappear in your discussion in different forms, and that is your discussion of the connectedness of things, of coherence in American education. And it came in several forms, which I will mention and then pick up on some of them. Imagination and experience, the bond between teaching and research, the interdisciplinary aspect of education, careerism and liberal learning. Connectedness is one of the things I've been thinking about a lot in terms of education, because I think that's one of the places that we're having the most difficulty understanding what it is we're trying to do in looking toward the future in education. But let's begin just with that area of interdisciplinary research and how that affects what happens in the classroom. As you mentioned, there is a great deal that is happening in research within the interstices between our traditional departments. History, you mentioned, works with anthropology, with sociology, et cetera. This is true, it seems to me, of much of the most exciting research occurring today. Do you see that affecting what we are doing in the classroom so that our students have the opportunity to study in terms of those new relationships between the traditional disciplines that are, in fact, divided into different departments?
I think it's hard, again, to generalize, and what I see is by and large what happens in the university that I'm most familiar with, or the few institutions that I'm most familiar with. I think that one sometimes sees that earlier in some of the graduate and even professional programs. I think we see it in professional schools. An obvious example is the growing interest in the social and ethical dimensions of medicine and of the dilemmas posed both by healthcare delivery and by the accomplishments, if you will, of medical science today. And while medical school curricula have not incorporated those in a very full way, one begins to see how in a professional school, which one thinks of often as vocational and particularly specialized in leading toward a given set of careers, in fact, such schools are often drawing on many other areas of the university. We see it at again, our university, where a program in clinical ethics, both a research and a teaching program, draws on people from such diverse areas as divinity, philosophy, sociology, economics, the law school, and if you can believe it, history. And where that combination of a number of people coming together in order to explore the frontiers of this new interdisciplinary approach leads ultimately to a teaching program, which goes beyond the medical school itself, but is, of course, particularly geared toward clinicians in training. I see it in the newer styles of graduate workshops that have appeared at our university, where people take topical themes and find that their methodologies and understandings are illuminated by people who work on similar kinds of problems, however different they may seem from other departments, and where that happening brings faculty as well as students together. And ultimately, again, new undergraduate programs come out of it. And finally, I've seen it happen over and over again in our university, which, if I can put in the short plug, has always had a core curriculum. Now, that core curriculum, as any curriculum needs to be, is reviewed recurrently, and particular aspects of it are modified or expanded or changed, so that a core curriculum today is different from a core curriculum 40 years ago, as it ought to be, because who would have thought 40 years ago that the emphasis on quantitative reasoning, for example, or quantitative skills would be as important as it is today? And yet, how can one understand the intellectual revolution of our time without understanding those things? So, at each of those levels, and mutually enriched, it seems to me, by professional, graduate, and undergraduate training, I see an awful lot happening, which isn't to say that everyone is doing it, but many departments are far more interdisciplinary states of their own than would have been the case 40 years ago.
Chicago has also, of course, always had the committees which involve that kind of interdisciplinary work, but I think in many institutions...
You don't think we planned this? We didn't.
In many universities, there's kind of political impulse to keep courses within the departments, and unless individuals bring in those various kinds of approaches, it becomes difficult, I think. Let's talk a little bit about careerism and liberal learning and how you see that intersection. I think that's, as you said, something that is being discussed now as though we've suddenly discovered there are two kinds of education out there. Whereas it seems to me in the best kind of connectedness, those two really support and reinforce one another in very strong ways. I think your example of medical school and the ethical studies that are involved are a good example. Do you think we're making too much of an issue of that kind of, as though there's either or rather than a kind of interrelationship between the two?
I think a bit too much. I mean, I do think I understand the concern when you see in an undergraduate college that offers, let's say, an undergraduate business major, 2/3 of the students majoring in business. Now, they may have a curriculum in which most of what they do is philosophy and mathematics, and maybe they're sitting at the edge of a bench all day long reading Plato, but you don't have the feeling that that's really what most of them are doing. And so there's that concern, namely, has there been too great a tilt toward taking degree courses and offering degree courses in undergraduate institutions with an eye toward the immediate job capacity that someone may have? I might add that that pressure has come from parents and from the larger society, and often the students are made to seem the villains. You know, students nowadays are patted on the head for not blowing up ROTC buildings, and then they're patted on the behind for not being activists and wanting to reform the world. It's a very confusing thing for students. They're told that they must be like those terrible people in the 50s, which was a non-generation. I've always resented that because I'm from the 50s. And I don't think of myself as a non-generation or as a totally bland type. But that's the stereotype. So these students are being told that they're like these awful people of the 50s, and they ought to have more social concern, a broader interest in the life of the intellect, a lessened concern with careers, and then they're asked what they're going to do for a job. And if they build shanties, everyone comes around, newspapers and photographers and so on, and say, oh my God, the campus is about to blow up again. It's just like the late 60s. And when you meet people, a lot of them say to you, how are things on campus? Are they quiet? As though these students who are said to be like the students of the 50s were behaving like the students of the 60s. It's a very confusing time, I think, for current students. We're trying to cope with a lot of different pressures. One of them is that they don't have a sort of extraordinary prosperity that allows them the luxury, as they feel, of taking forever to make up their minds. They work, they take out loans, and they have the pressure of being asked where they're going to be when they grow up, and they're being asked to grow up rather quickly. And it's also made clear to them that they're not meant to grow up into yuppies, but on the other hand, a lot of them do. Now, what I see are students who are trying to find a balance between those things, who are terribly interested in what they're studying, who want breadth, who want to explore, and who at the same time are very worried about whether they're indulging themselves sometimes in doing that. I see students who are having to make the same kinds of choices and try to create the same kinds of balances that you and I do, and who aren't, as perhaps seemed true for students in an earlier age, given 4 years of freedom in which they're exempt from that. And that is, to my mind, the condition of the kinds of liberal arts students that I see today. So I guess there are a lot of future yuppies among them too.
One of the questions I've been playing with in my mind when we're looking at these kinds of contrarieties that we want to make into connections is the connection between our trying to foster a sense of independence and strength and a sense of community, cooperativeness, involvement in the social values. It seems to me that in our pedagogical approaches, we do much better by independence. That our approach tends to be to encourage people to make the best possible grades they can make, et cetera, rather than doing anything within the classroom experience to build a sense of collaborativeness. And how do we get at that kind of piece of what we want to send students out with? The sense that community is important, that, as Alexander Pope said, self-love and social are the same.
I think it's hard to do in the classroom in many ways. I think that those institutions that really can emphasize small classes and that really can emphasize what is improperly called the Socratic method Everyone keeps saying that Socratic method as though it was a bunch of people sitting around and discovering knowledge together. Socrates always knew what the conclusion was and kept whipping people along to get there, except he'd allow them to speak and then he'd tell them they were wrong. And in that sense, I think a lot more of the teaching that goes on has been like the genuine Socrates than the supposed Socrates, namely the master of drawing out in collaboration people's sense in some continuous way of engaging with other minds in order to come to some truth and discuss to some purpose. I think it's a difficult thing to do, and even in such situations, there can be too much competition, and there can be people who are shy about entering, and there's always the loudmouth who keeps some other people from entering those discussions. But over time, I think that while I believe it's not the only mode of education, there's much to be said for the good lecture course. Still, your kind, the communitarian intellectual experience, I think, has to take place in those small groups.
Mm-hmm. We have a number of questions from the audience, and let me begin with a few of those. Here's one that says, what is or can be done by academics in colleges and universities to improve the quality of education and increase the desire for higher education and intellectualism at the high school level?
I think that there are some signs that colleges and universities are taking a bit more of a role in thinking about high schools and their relationship to schools. I think that there are two ways, of course, in which colleges can make a difference in schools, or maybe there are three. I mean, one, obviously, in the kind of research and policy studies that universities may undertake, but that's really not going to have a whole lot to do with the particular question that was asked, although it may help to elevate and redirect some portions of secondary education, and of course their curricular development and so forth. The second, and I think it's one that colleges can rely on in wrong ways, is to set standards for admission that high schools then want their students to be able to meet. When I say that I think they've sometimes been used in wrong ways, I think that there was a time when colleges thought they were doing that and really weren't paying any attention to what was happening in schools, and therefore there was really a double standard there. And the third, which doesn't necessarily speak to the self-interest of colleges and the particular students who might be admitted, but which speaks to their making a difference where the only difference can be made in practice in a direct way, is to work with the schools in their own community. Now, there are hundreds of colleges that have to do that in hundreds of communities, but there are ways in which institutions of higher education, I think, can help to make a difference in, let us say, 2 or 3 schools in their own community. And that doesn't seem very dramatic. It doesn't seem to have a kind of national effect, but in a country where we have a tradition of local schools and where the conditions that make possible one or another reform or activity in a school are going to vary from an inner city school to a suburban school, I really do think that we need to be doing more in those ways. And I think that our students are interested in that as well. And one of the things that I would like to see finally is, again, a resurgence of interest in teaching on the part of our students. That is something that's declined so badly. And our students are working so hard, working to earn money to put themselves through college as well as studying. I'd like to see a kind of work-study program where students could be interns in schools, and that would be the job that they would have in earning money. I just think there's a whole lot more we can do. But broadly speaking, the setting of standards, the articulation of standards, and the stretching of standards obviously has to take place at all 3 levels.
Students interning in schools would really get at the community aspect of education as well.
Yes.
Private universities such as the University of Chicago are becoming increasingly expensive, and some schools have dropped need-blind admissions. Do you feel a college education is more and more a privilege for the rich?
Well, the costs of higher education, of course, have gone up. It's not only that the price of higher education in the private sector has gone up, and of course, it's very understandable that should be such a concern. I hope no one will misunderstand me when I say that people who compare tuitions now with tuitions when they were in school often give themselves heart attacks and forget that if they were to compare the cost of a car now with the cost of a car then, or a house now with that of a house then, they wouldn't be as surprised. But it's always shocking to us to think, I mean, I remember what I paid when I was in college, and you remember what you paid when you were in college. Secondly, there's a grave misunderstanding about the costs of public education. The costs are as high as private, but the price is different because somebody else is paying, and we tend to forget that. Thirdly, I think major private institutions of higher education are also universities, research centers, centers of collection, centers for the nation, and often international centers, which have a kind of obligation to maintain collections and to provide facilities, which others, as well as the citizens of their own community, can benefit from. And I think that the terrible fear that private higher education will price itself out of the market means that private higher education is surely going to have to retrench in a variety of ways, but I hope that we will not be forced to retrench in the sense that it is assumed that all we should be doing is educating undergraduates, which costs less than if you were to educate graduates and undergraduates, or less than if you didn't have a major library or whatever it might be. And that's really why I think that the Secretary of Education makes somewhat misleading statements when he talks about price. Now, I believe in need-blind admissions, and our university does, as do a number of others and other colleges as well. I think that the breaking of that pattern and the creation of more merit-based awards becomes a kind of competition for students who are not needy for resources that might otherwise go to needier students. So no, I don't think that it's becoming a privilege for the rich, but I fear that the perception of many needier people is that they shouldn't even think about a private institution because they hear about the cost and they don't realize what the discount is. They hear what the tuition is, and they don't realize that only a percentage of people are paying that tuition. And the real cost of a university like ours, or the Ivy League institutions, is going to be that combination of what a student or student family and job-related income can bring, plus a grant from the university. If we could find a way of making clearer that that is our commitment, and that the price isn't the sticker and isn't some simple negotiation based on politics, but really does have these different levels, I think people might be a little less worried about it. But the perception of high cost is in itself already, I think, potentially an obstacle to many people applying, and therefore there could be some tilt toward higher income.
You know, I think the emphasis and attention that undergraduate education is now receiving will inevitably result in greater attention to graduate education. I mean, that seems to me just the next step in what our discussion is. And I certainly agree with you about the connectedness of research and teaching. I think there are people who are good researchers and bad teachers.
Yes.
I'm not at all sure there are good teachers who are not good researchers. I mean, I think the two are so closely interrelated. even if, as is my case, one never teaches what one does one's research in, it really affects everything one does in teaching, I think.
I agree, and I think often the caricature of the publish or perish syndrome, people say, well, why do you have to publish X amount in order to be a teacher? It's not the volume of what is taught, it's of what is published or what is researched, it's the quality of that.
That's right. And the qualities of mind and understanding that come with.
Mm-hmm.
The question is often asked, how does liberal education prepare persons for the real world? But do you have any thoughts about how the real world can be better prepared for, can better incorporate the liberally educated individual?
I was today at a meeting of the board of directors of a bank, and I'm chairman for that board of their employment policies and benefits committee, and we had a meeting today in which they were talking about the recruitment of people to the bank and the competition for very good people and what kinds of people they were attracting into their training program and so forth. And these were executives of the bank, one of whom had majored in political science, one of whom had majored in history of art, one of whom had majored in English, and one of whom had majored in some other subject of that kind. And I asked them how it was that the ad that this bank puts in student newspapers when it goes to recruit on the campus, which emphasizes quantitative skills and studies, how it was that all these liberally educated people who are obviously among the most competent people doing the work that they're doing at their bank managed to go to liberal arts colleges and seem to be asking for a particular kind, at least the student would perceive it as looking for a particular kind of major. It would put off a student who hadn't majored in economics, mathematics, maybe statistics, maybe computer science or something like that. It never occurred to them that, of course, they were themselves the exemplars of people with good minds and broad educations who probably had a bit of quantitative work in their core curricula, that of course they were practically saying to students, you can't be like us, but it never occurred to them. Now, one very simple way, I think, for the real world to get prepared for the liberally educated is to remember a very simple thing like this. Another, I think, is not to push too hard, to assume that the real world is meeting a payroll. You have to meet payrolls in the real world, but you have to meet payrolls in college too. They just have different names. And the fact is that of course, people who come out of college have not had the experience, and everybody loves sort of cutting people down to the appropriate size. They come with great theories about how they're going to manage everything or how they're going to know better, and then they learn. Well, it's another form of learning. It's not what college is for. You can do that the rest of your life. So I think not pushing too hard, remembering that, but also remembering from one's own experience that these young people of high aspirations have a terrible tendency to think that they're going to make a choice and then the world is going to close in around them. To help to educate people as they come into the real world that they shouldn't lose any of that, but that no choice is ever definitive. That while it closes off some, it opens up others. And that all our lives are full of the unexpected, and that unexpected is often informed by ideas and competences and interests that have been formed in college. That's a very good thing for all of us to remember in the real world, and for them to help us keep alive. Those are some random thoughts on the question.
Another question, how do you reconcile interdisciplinary approaches with the problem of academic turf? We touched on this earlier.
Not easy, I think, because departments do tend to be where the where the ultimate commitments are made. Departments are likely to be demanding of people's time and attention, and are likely to be where the rewards and the recommendations for rewards are made. And faculty who are divided among a series of fields have lots of joint appointments. We do it primarily by everybody being on 2 or 3 joint appointments so that they all forget where they originally belonged.
Confused.
And are terribly overstretched. But it is a problem because the interdisciplinary program may work wonderfully, and then the person says, well, I've really got to do more in my department, so that they can't depend on being the primary place of allegiance of people. And I think in order to do it, therefore, an environment has to be created where interdisciplinariness is made very easy to accomplish, made very easy so you don't cost account people's time, you don't set up tariff barriers, you don't set up visa requirements. It's really a free trade zone that you have to set up. And you have to keep emphasizing the virtues of free trade and sort of slap away protectionism wherever it can be found. It's not easy. And ultimately, I think it requires an environment that nurtures that and where a faculty is committed to it. And it doesn't happen overnight.
I think I have continued past the time we were meant to quit. I want to thank you very much for a most stimulating evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.